Rachel Holt for NESN.com here with Ryan Fowler of Fox Sports. Ryan, thanks for joining us.
You got it, Rachel.
Ryan, there's a number of interesting things that happened in Week 14 that I want to recap before we delve into Week 15. First, a number of top quarterbacks did not perform the way we needed them to in the fantasy football playoffs. I'm looking at you, Big Ben. I'm looking at you, Drew Brees, and Russell Wilson, all guys that kind of flopped for us. On the other side of that, Le'Veon Bell put up monster points, 236 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns. He put up the most points out of anyone this year in fantasy. So 2 opposite ends of the spectrum. For you, what was the biggest surprise in Week 14?
Well, I think one thing had to happen for this to occur, and that was Matt Forte going down with injury for the Jets in the first series against the Niners, opening the door for Bilal Powell. I mean, if you go back to August and you read some analysis pieces about who you should draft late in drafts and who you should take a look at or a flyer on, a lot of people thought it was going to be a 50-50 split with Matt Forte and Bilal Powell this whole year. And you might remember back in September, Matt Forte came out of the gates hot. I mean, he was posting monster games for owners in September, and then he disappeared. And Bilal Powell kind of took the reins. He was getting 10 to 15 fantasy points per game, and then it swung back to Matt Forte. So Forte goes down, and then Bilal Powell gets the Niners the worst rush defense in fantasy terms in the NFL, and he goes off because he can catch out of the backfield, PPR friendly, and then he drops 35 fantasy points. And it's interesting, in our fantasy league that we compete in, you're going to be in the semifinals against John Halpin. I'll be facing Jeff Stotts of rotowire.com. I was able to advance with Bilal Powell against a guy that had Le'Veon Bell and Carlos Hyde. So Bilal Powell, I think he really does take the cake as the biggest surprise. And sure, Forte had to go down, but still 35 points with him down. I don't think a lot of people thought that.
Anyone who won in a league that they had to play Le'Veon Bell this week deserves to brag all week long about that. Congratulations to you. I look forward to competing in that league and seeing who comes out on top after all of the chats we've been doing all week long. But you mentioned the injury to Matt Forte. There was also an injury to Melvin Gordon and Ryan Tannehill. There was a couple of top guys that went down this week. So in terms of guys who might benefit from those injuries in Week 15, who are you looking at?
Well, yeah, let's start in San Diego with Melvin Gordon. I would be shocked if he played this week. I think that hip injury, that knee injury, it looked worse on tape than it actually has been in reports. We'll find out more throughout the day on Tuesday when we tape this. But let's look at the rookie, Kenneth Ferro. Comes in, PPR friendly. I think he only had like 20, 30 yards, but 6 receptions. So I think where you have to be careful is Ronnie Hillman was signed by the Chargers a couple weeks ago after the Vikings let him go. I would be very careful on going all in on Ferro as a flex option this week. And he did have some pretty good numbers after he took over for Gordon last week against the Panthers. I just wouldn't go crazy on that. And then you mentioned Ryan Tannehill, and you know, Matt Moore is probably one of the more serviceable backups in the league, but this definitely impacts Jarvis Landry. It impacts Devontae Parker if he can stay healthy. Kenny Stills has had a nice stretch, even though he has had a roller coaster of production. This is a Jay Ajayi game. I mean, the Jets' rush defense, I did a little video on foxsports.com/fantasy about this. The Jets' rush defense was very, very strong in the first half of the season. It's stunk up the joint the last month, 5 games. So Jay Ajayi could just have a huge role in this Week 15 matchup with Tannehill down, Matt Moore in there. You could see 25, 30 carries out of Jay in Week 15, and that's what owners want. I mean, Jay, he hasn't been as good as he was earlier on in the season, but this is the matchup you want heading into the semifinals for a lot of leagues.
Okay, those are some guys that may benefit from injuries around the league. As far as guys to take off the waiver wire, we're mostly working with what we got at this point. We want our top guys to be in there, the ones that we've counted on all year long. But are there any guys who impressed you in Week 14 that you would maybe bet on in Week 15?
You know, look at Pierre Garçon. I mean, he was one of my waiver claim mentions last week. He goes out there, has a nice game against the Eagles. They have the Panthers pass defense on Monday night in Week 15. I mean, you mentioned it. We're kind of working with what we have. But I think Pierre Garçon might be the top wide receiver taken off the waiver wire this week, along with Bilal Powell, because we know his ownership is under 50% in a lot of leagues. So Powell, Pierre Garçon is a guy I would look at. But I still think, you know, Ladarius Green, he's being eased back into this, but you still have to like what you see there. Another deep cut at tight end is Tre Burton. You know, Zach Ertz with Carson Wentz has done great things over the last 2 months as far as consistency in that tight end position. Tre Burton, 19 targets over the last 2 weeks as the tight end too. I think they're using him more like a wide receiver because after Jordan Matthews, it's kind of thin there in receiver land for the Philadelphia Eagles. Plus Wendell Smallwood placed on season-ending IR, Darren Sproles in concussion protocol. You could see a little bit more of Tre Burton at tight end for the Eagles in Week 15.
Ryan, we mentioned these quarterbacks that are giving us headaches. I have Drew Brees in one of my leagues, and I don't even know if I want to start him in Week 15. Are there any guys that we wouldn't normally start you're looking at to have a pretty good Week 15 as far as quarterbacks go?
Yeah, Drew Brees has a lot of people nervous going into Week 15. You're not alone, especially the Cardinals. They can be picked apart, but Tyrann Mathieu, he's been inactive a bunch over the last month, so you kind of have to pay attention to that. But Drew Brees on the road it just doesn't work. I don't know what it is. It might be between the ears now with Drew Brees, kind of a mental psych out there. You know, my Monday night chat that I host every single week, the big name that kept coming up at quarterback was Alex Smith. You know, Chiefs, they're not first thought is passing, but you get Macklin back. Tyreek Hill had another nice game last week, and the Titans' pass defense, you can chew that up. Trevor Siemian posted some monster numbers for Emmanuel Sanders and Demaryius Thomas in Week 14, so why couldn't Alex Smith? He's a game manager, doesn't take a lot of risks. I think I'm starting to come around. Last night I was like, oh, Alex Smith in the fantasy semifinals, that's tough to swallow, but I think, again, home game, Titans are probably going to turn the ball over a little bit there. I think Alex Smith is the way to go.
A lot of questions moving into Week 15 at not the best time, I will say that. As far as matchups go in this week, are there any enticing ones out there that have a lot of implications in the fantasy football world?
Well, yeah, and another big question mark is what Green Bay team's going to step up, right? I mean, when you look at what the Packers have done in recent weeks, now they get Chicago at Chicago. Can they keep this going? Because the one headache right now, and it's like a great problem for the Packers, but it's a horrible problem for owners, is Jordy Nelson and Devontae Adams. Now, granted, both were able to do some great work against the Seahawks last week, but can they do it week in and week out? And that's one of the headaches that you kind of have to deal with. I still think Jordy Nelson is the more consistent option, and I have a lot more faith in that happening week in and week out. But look who popped up on the radar in Week 14, Ty Montgomery. Starting to use that running back role, that hybrid role that everybody wanted position eligibility at RB and wide receiver. They roll him back in there, had a pretty nice game. The other game that you got to pay attention to is the Detroit Lions. Eli Manning and Matthew Stafford, he's got a finger injury, kind of like what Derek Carr's dealing with the Raiders. Matthew Stafford has a lot of people nervous, and that's where that Alex Smith question came up so much in my Monday night chat. It's, man, Alex Smith or Matthew Stafford? Well, Alex is healthy. The Titans' pass defense not so great. And we know what the Giants defense did to Dak Prescott and company. I'd be very nervous about Matthew Stafford heading into this weekend because the Giants defense seems like it's only getting better, and it was able to slow down the machine of the Cowboys over the weekend.
So Ryan, this is a big week for us. For some people, there's pride on the line. For some people, it's money. For some people, it's a physical trophy. But we need to brush up and make sure we know our stuff heading into Week 15. Where can we find more from you throughout the week?
Sure, you can go to foxsports.com/fantasy. You can check me out on Twitter at FoxSportsFowler. And then we're on Facebook, Fox Sports Fantasy. And the one thing I also kind of want to stress, Tom Brady against the Broncos in Week 15, that's going to be dicey. I know he had a monster game against the Ravens, but Aqib Talib in that secondary, that could be a little bit of a shocker for owners if they're expecting 25-plus fantasy points. I know Nelson and the audience doesn't want to hear it, but let's be careful about that heading into Week 15.
Right. Well, Tom Brady certainly wasn't on our list of quarterbacks who didn't perform in Week 14, but moving ahead, we're not so sure. Thanks so much, Ryan. Good luck in Week 15, everyone.